You don't even meet the minimum qualifications. Security, escort her out. The words cut across the executive boardroom like a blade, sharp enough to silence the low hum of conversation and freeze every set of eyes in place, and yet Vanessa Carter didn't flinch, not even a flicker, not even a breath out of rhythm, because she had heard variations of that sentence before, different rooms, different faces, same assumption, delivered with that same quiet certainty that she did not belong, that she had somehow wandered into a space built for someone else, someone who looked different, spoke different, carried themselves in a way that made others comfortable, and now here she was again, seated at the far end of a polished 12-foot walnut conference table on the 32nd floor of a Manhattan high-rise, sunlight slicing through floor-to-ceiling glass behind her, casting long reflections across a room filled with tailored suits and curated confidence, while the man who had spoken, Gregory Hale, Senior Operations Director, mid-50s, silver hair and a voice trained to sound like authority, stood with his arms folded as if he had already won whatever this moment was supposed to be, as if the outcome had been decided the second she walked in wearing a simple charcoal blazer, no designer label visible, no entourage trailing behind her, no introduction announced over intercoms or emails, just a quiet presence that disrupted the room more than any loud entrance ever could. And still Vanessa remained seated, hands resting lightly on the table, posture relaxed but deliberate, as if she were anchored there by something deeper than permission, something no one in that room could see yet, something they weren't even looking for, because they had already made their decision the moment they saw her, and the room began to shift around that decision, whispers threading through the air like static, a woman near the center glancing sideways to her colleague with a faint smirk, a younger analyst tapping his pen a little too quickly against his notepad. Someone near the door pulling out a phone as if instinct told them this might turn into something worth recording, while Gregory took a step forward, voice tightening just enough to make it clear this was no suggestion. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stand up and leave," he said, slower this time, as if repetition would make it more true, and still Vanessa didn't move, didn't argue, didn't defend herself, because power, real power, didn't rush to explain, it waited, it observed, it let the room reveal itself piece by piece, and in that stillness, something subtle began to crack beneath the surface, a tension not loud but unmistakable, the kind that builds when certainty starts to feel fragile, when a moment doesn't unfold the way it's supposed to, when the person being dismissed refuses to play the role assigned to them, and Vanessa's eyes moved once, slowly, across the table, not searching for approval but taking inventory, memorizing faces, voices, tones, because every word spoken in this room was being measured, every assumption quietly recorded, and somewhere in the back row, a young intern named Tyler Brooks frowned at his tablet, scrolling through an internal memo he had barely skimmed earlier that morning, a memo about leadership changes, about transitions, about a name that now sat heavy in his mind as he looked up again at the woman everyone else had already decided didn't belong, and for the first time, the room wasn't just tense, it was uncertain, and uncertainty, in a place like this, was the first sign that control was slipping, even if no one had realized it yet. Gregory Hale's expression tightened when she did not move, the silence stretching just long enough to make his authority feel questioned, and in a room built on hierarchy that kind of pause was dangerous, so he filled it the only way he knew how, by doubling down, his voice rising just a fraction as he gestured toward the glass doors. "We do not have time for this," he said, each word clipped and deliberate. "This is an executive review session, not an open call," and a few heads nodded around the table, not because they fully agreed but because agreement was easier than uncertainty, because aligning with the loudest voice in the room had always been the safest move, yet Vanessa Carter remained exactly where she was, her stillness now more noticeable than any reaction could have been, like a fixed point in a room slowly losing its balance, and it began to draw attention in ways no one had expected, subtle at first, a shift in posture here, a glance there, until the energy of the room no longer flowed around Gregory but started circling her, and that was when the questions came, not direct, not yet, but layered in tone and implication. A woman in a navy suit leaned forward slightly and said, "Maybe there has been a scheduling mistake," her smile polite but her eyes distant, while another voice from the far end added, "Do you have documentation for this meeting?" phrased like a courtesy but carrying the weight of a challenge, and Vanessa listened without interruption, absorbing each word the way someone reads a contract line by line, not for what is said but for what is revealed beneath it, and somewhere behind her, near the back wall, Tyler Brooks felt his pulse pick up as he stared down at his tablet again, scrolling back to the email he had skimmed earlier, the subject line now louder in his mind than it had been before, executive transition confirmation, and beneath it a name that did not match the assumptions unfolding in front of him, a name that now sat directly across the room from him, calm, composed, and entirely out of place only because everyone had decided she should be, and he looked up again, this time longer, studying her face, her posture, the quiet certainty. That did not align with someone who had wandered into the wrong room, and doubt began to take root, small but persistent, while Gregory moved closer to the table, placing both hands flat against its polished surface as if proximity could reassert control. Last chance, he said, lowering his voice into something colder, more controlled, stand up and walk out, or we will have you removed, and that word, removed, lingered in the air longer than it should have, heavier than the situation justified, because it was no longer about procedure, it was about power, about who had the right to decide who stayed and who left, and Vanessa finally moved, but not in the way anyone expected, not rising, not retreating, but simply shifting her gaze upward to meet his, steady and unhurried, her expression unreadable yet precise, as if she were measuring not him but the moment itself, and when she spoke her voice was calm, level, almost quiet, but it carried through the room with a clarity that cut deeper than any raised tone ever could. You seem very confident in your assessment, she said, not as a question but as a statement, and something about the way she said it caused a ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, because confidence, real confidence, did not ask for permission to exist, it revealed itself in moments like this, and Tyler's grip tightened around his tablet as the pieces in his mind refused to settle back into place. Because if she was who he thought she might be, then everything happening in this room was already beyond correction, and the realization came with a quiet weight that pressed against his chest, because this was no longer a misunderstanding, it was something else entirely, something that once revealed would not just disrupt the meeting but redefine it, and for the first time since she walked in, the room was not just judging her, it was beginning to question itself. The room did not exhale after she spoke. It tightened, like a structure under stress that had not yet decided where it would crack, and Gregory Hale felt it before he understood it, the shift in attention, the way eyes no longer followed his lead automatically, the way uncertainty began to dilute the authority he had relied on for years, and that loss, even in small measure, made him sharper, more deliberate. Confidence comes from experience, he replied, his tone controlled but edged now. And experience tells me when someone is out of place, and there it was again. Not just a statement but a conclusion delivered as fact, a line drawn not by policy but by perception, and a few people nodded again, slower this time, less certain, because something about the moment no longer fit the script they were used to, and Vanessa Carter let the words settle without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if she were allowing the room to fully reveal itself. Before she decided what to do with it, and that patience, that refusal to react on their terms, began to feel heavier than any confrontation could have been, while across the table a senior analyst cleared his throat and leaned forward, attempting to restore order with procedure. If you are here for a scheduled review, he said, choosing his words carefully, we will need to verify your credentials before proceeding. And it sounded reasonable, almost neutral, but the tone carried something else, something that questioned her presence rather than clarified it, and Vanessa's eyes shifted to him briefly, acknowledging the statement without validating it, while behind her Tyler Brooks felt the tension building in his chest, because the more the room spoke, the clearer the disconnect became, and he could not ignore it anymore, not the name on the email, not the timing, not the way she carried herself with a certainty that did not match someone being questioned, and he glanced down again at his screen, scrolling further, confirming details, the onboarding notice, the executive clearance, the timestamp from earlier that morning, and his heart rate picked up as the realization sharpened into something undeniable, something that made everything happening in this room feel dangerously misaligned, and yet he hesitated, because speaking up meant stepping against the current of authority, meant challenging people who had defined the rules long before he arrived, and that hesitation held him in place just long enough for Gregory to take another step forward, reclaiming the space with a firmer presence. We are done entertaining this, he said, turning slightly toward the door as if the outcome had already been decided. I am calling security, and the word landed heavier this time, not just procedural but final, a signal that the situation had crossed from disagreement into enforcement. And a quiet ripple moved through the room, chairs shifting, shoulders straightening, a few people exchanging glances that carried both curiosity and discomfort, because escalation always changed the tone, always made things more real, and Vanessa finally moved again, not to stand, not to leave, but to reach calmly into her bag and place her phone on the table in front of her, the motion simple, unhurried, but precise enough to draw attention, and when she spoke her voice remained even, measured, but there was a subtle shift beneath it now, something firmer, something that suggested the moment they thought they controlled was already slipping beyond their reach. "Go ahead," she said, looking directly at Gregory. "Call whoever you think you need," and the way she said it was not defiance, it was permission, the kind that reversed the dynamic without raising her voice, and for a brief second, barely noticeable but unmistakable to those paying close attention, Gregory paused, not because he doubted himself, but because something in her certainty did not align with the outcome he expected, and Tyler felt it too, that split-second hesitation, that crack in the sequence, and it was enough, just enough, to push him forward, his voice quiet at first but clear enough to cut through the tension. "Sir," he said, standing halfway from his seat, eyes fixed on Gregory but flicking once toward Vanessa, "I think we should double-check the executive onboarding list before we escalate this," and the room shifted again, sharper this time, because now the doubt was no longer silent, it had a voice, and once doubt is spoken out loud, it does not disappear, it grows. The moment Tyler Brooks spoke, the room did not just shift, it recalibrated, because uncertainty spoken aloud carries weight that silence never could, and Gregory Hale turned slowly toward him, his expression tightening not with confusion but with irritation, the kind that surfaces when control is challenged from an unexpected direction, especially by someone lower in the hierarchy. "This is not your concern," Gregory said, his voice measured but firm, attempting to compress the disruption back into something manageable, but Tyler did not sit down, not this time, his posture still half-raised, caught between instinct and consequence, yet anchored by something stronger than both, because what he had seen on that screen was no longer something he could ignore, and the hesitation that had held him back seconds ago had already given way to clarity. "Sir, with respect," Tyler continued, his voice steadier now, "the onboarding memo this morning listed a new executive arrival, and the name matches," and he stopped there, not finishing the sentence, because he did not need to, the implication hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable, and for the first time since this began, multiple heads turned not toward Gregory but toward Vanessa Carter, really looking this time, not just seeing her presence but questioning their assumption about it, and that shift, subtle but undeniable, fractured the room's certainty in a way no argument could have, while Gregory let out a short breath through his nose, dismissive on the surface but strained beneath it. "A memo does not override protocol," he said quickly, stepping away from the table as if movement could re-establish momentum, "and protocol says we verify before we accommodate." But the words landed differently now, less like authority and more like defense, because the room had already begun to question the premise itself, and Vanessa watched it unfold with the same quiet composure, her expression unchanged, her presence now more defined by what she had not done than what she had, because she had not argued, had not raised her voice, had not insisted on recognition, and that restraint began to carry its own kind of authority, the kind that forces others to confront their own behavior without being told to, and a woman near the center of the table glanced at her laptop, fingers hesitating above the keyboard before she finally began typing, pulling up internal directories, cross-checking names, while another executive leaned back slightly in his chair, arms no longer crossed in certainty but resting loosely, as if he were no longer sure what position to hold, and Tyler took a step forward now, fully standing. His tablet angled slightly toward Gregory but visible enough for others to see. "The system shows full executive clearance," he said, not louder but clearer, each word landing with precision, "effective this morning," and that was the moment the room changed again, not dramatically, not with noise or reaction, but with recognition beginning to surface beneath the surface tension, because now there was data, something objective, something that did not rely on perception or assumption, and data, in a room like this, had power. While Gregory's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly toward the tablet before returning to Vanessa, as if trying to reconcile two conflicting realities at once, one built on what he believed he saw, and one built on what was now being presented in front of him, and for a brief second. The space between those two realities became visible, and it was uncomfortable, not just for him but for everyone watching, because it forced a question none of them wanted to ask out loud: what if they were wrong? And Vanessa finally leaned back slightly in her chair, not retreating but settling, as if the room had now reached the point she had been waiting for, and when she spoke again her voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was a clarity to it that cut through the lingering doubt. "You might want to take a closer look," she said, her eyes moving briefly toward Tyler's screen before returning to Gregory, "before you decide what protocol requires," and the sentence did not challenge him, it exposed him, because it suggested that what he had been enforcing was not protocol at all, but assumption, and once that distinction becomes visible, it cannot be unseen, and around the table, the quiet began to deepen, not empty but charged, because everyone could feel it now. The moment before something irreversible reveals itself, the point where perception no longer holds and reality begins to take its place, whether they were ready for it or not. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty, it felt heavy, like something waiting to break, and for a brief moment no one spoke, not Gregory Hale, not the executives around the table, not even Tyler Brooks, whose tablet was still angled forward like a quiet piece of evidence no one could ignore anymore, and in that stillness Vanessa Carter let her gaze drift, not nervously, not searching for support, but calmly, deliberately, as if she had stepped outside the tension entirely and was observing it from a distance. And that composure did something the room was not prepared for. It made their urgency look misplaced, their certainty look fragile, and Gregory felt it, even if he refused to acknowledge it, his jaw tightening as he straightened his posture again, clinging to the last threads of control. "We are not making decisions based on partial information," he said, his tone sharper now, less polished, more reactive. "And we are certainly not reversing protocol because of a clerical coincidence," and the word coincidence landed awkwardly, because no one in the room fully believed it anymore, not after what Tyler had shown, not after the name had been spoken without being spoken, and across the table the woman who had been typing earlier stopped, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she turned her laptop slightly toward the others beside her, whispering something under her breath that carried just enough to shift the energy again, and one by one, screens began to light up, internal directories opened, names cross-checked, access levels reviewed, and the room that had once been united in quiet dismissal was now divided by silent verification, and that division spread quickly, because once doubt enters a system built on assumption, it does not stay contained, it multiplies, it forces people to look again, to question what they thought they knew, and Tyler took a slow breath, his voice lower now but steady. "It is not partial," he said, not looking at Gregory this time but at the screen in front of him, as if the truth there mattered more than the authority in front of him. "It is confirmed," and the word confirmed did not echo loudly, but it carried weight, the kind that settles deep rather than spreads wide, and for the first time Gregory did not respond immediately, his eyes flicking again toward the tablet, toward the laptops now angled slightly inward as others reviewed the same information, and something shifted behind his expression, not acceptance, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes just before realization, and Vanessa watched it all without interruption, her stillness now no longer passive but intentional, because she had seen this moment before, not in this room, not with these people, but in different spaces, years earlier, when she was 26 sitting in a glass-walled interview room downtown, her resume printed on thick paper, her credentials laid out clearly, and still the hiring manager had leaned back and said, "You do not seem like the right fit for this level," the same tone, the same quiet dismissal disguised as professionalism. And she had walked out that day knowing the decision had already been made before she spoke, knowing that what they saw had outweighed what she had earned, and that memory did not sting anymore, it anchored her, because it reminded her that this moment was not new, it was a pattern, one she had outgrown, one she had built beyond, and now here she was again, not asking for entry but sitting at the center of a system that still had not learned to recognize her without instruction, and Gregory finally spoke again. But the edge in his voice had dulled, replaced by something tighter, more controlled. "If there has been an update," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then it should have been communicated more clearly," and the shift was subtle but undeniable, because he was no longer dismissing her, he was adjusting the narrative, reframing the situation to preserve authority, and around the table a few heads nodded again, but differently this time, not in agreement but in transition. Because the room was no longer certain of its position, and Vanessa leaned forward. Slightly, her hands resting calmly on the table, her voice steady as she spoke. It was communicated, she said, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. You just did not look for it, and the words did not accuse, they revealed, and in a room built on perception, that kind of clarity was more disruptive than any confrontation. Gregory Hale did not respond right away, and that hesitation, brief as it was, did more to shift the room than any argument could have, because for the first time his authority was not filling the space, it was searching for footing, and everyone could feel it, the subtle imbalance, the moment where control was no longer assumed but questioned, and Vanessa Carter recognized it. Instantly, not as a victory but as a transition point, the exact moment when perception begins to fracture and reality starts to surface, and she did not rush it, did not press forward, because timing, she had learned, was not about speed but precision, and the room needed just a few more seconds to fully reveal itself, and it did, slowly, quietly, as more screens turned, more eyes scanned internal records, more silent confirmations passed between executives who just minutes ago had been aligned in quiet dismissal, and now found themselves recalibrating in real time, while Tyler Brooks remained standing, no longer uncertain, his role in the moment now defined not by his title but by his willingness to speak when it mattered, and across the table one of the senior directors cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a reset. Gregory, he said carefully, not confrontational but no longer passive, if the system reflects executive clearance, then we need to pause and verify before taking any further action, and the language had shifted, noticeably, from dismissal to procedure, from assumption to confirmation, and Gregory heard it, even if he did not like it, his posture tightening again as he looked from one face to another, searching for the alignment that had supported him moments earlier and finding it fractured, incomplete, and that realization pressed against him in a way he could not ignore, because leadership in a room like this depended on consensus, and consensus was slipping, and Vanessa finally reached for her phone, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same calm precision that had defined every movement she made since she walked in, placing it flat on the table and tapping the screen once, a small action that carried a quiet finality, and when she spoke her voice remained even, controlled, but there was a clarity to it now that signaled the moment had shifted from observation to action. Go ahead and pull up the executive payroll authorization file, she said, not directing it to anyone in particular, yet somehow to everyone at once, and the sentence landed with a weight that extended beyond its words, because it was not a request, it was an instruction, one that assumed compliance rather than asked for it, and that assumption, subtle as it was, reframed the entire dynamic of the room, and a few executives glanced at each other before one of them turned to his laptop, fingers moving almost instinctively, navigating through secured folders, authentication prompts appearing and clearing, and the room grew quieter with each second that passed, not with tension this time but with anticipation, because now there was a direction, a path toward something definitive, and Gregory watched it unfold, his expression controlled but increasingly constrained, because he could feel the shift accelerating beyond his ability to contain it, and Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze steady, her presence now fully anchored in the space not by recognition but by inevitability, and for a brief moment no one spoke, no one moved unnecessarily, because everyone sensed that whatever appeared next on that screen would not just answer a question, it would redefine the entire room, and Vanessa's voice came once more, softer this time but no less precise. Let it load, she said, her eyes moving across the table, meeting each gaze without hesitation. You will want to see this clearly, and there was no edge in her tone, no trace of anger or urgency, just certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it already knows what is coming. And in that moment the room was no longer deciding what to do with her, it was waiting to understand what she was about to do with them. The screen finished loading with a quiet flicker, and for a second no one spoke, not because they did not understand what they were seeing, but because they understood it too well. The executive payroll authorization file sitting open on the large display at the front of the room, clean, official, undeniable, and at the very top of the document, above every department, above every name, above every salary line that defined the structure of power inside that company, was one name in bold. Unmistakable and final, Vanessa Carter, Chief Executive Officer, and the weight of it did not crash into the room all at once, it Spread slowly, like a realization moving from one person to the next, each face processing it in real time, each expression shifting from certainty to disbelief to something quieter, something heavier, and Gregory Hale stared at the screen as if it might correct itself, as if there had been some error in the system that would restore the version of reality he had been operating in just minutes ago, but nothing changed. The file remained, the name remained, the structure remained, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was absolute, and Vanessa Carter stood up, not abruptly, not to dominate the space, but with a calm, deliberate motion that drew every eye in the room without effort, her presence now fully aligned with the authority that had been questioned, and when she spoke her voice was steady, measured, but carried a clarity that cut through whatever remained of denial. "You said I do not meet the minimum qualifications," she began, her eyes moving briefly to Gregory before sweeping across the table, meeting each person where they sat, and yet every system in this company, every department represented in this room, every salary processed under this structure. She paused just long enough for the words to settle, not rushed, not forced, just precise, "is authorized by me," and the sentence did not rise in volume, it did not need to, because the truth behind it carried more force than any raised voice could have, and around the table no one interrupted, no one challenged, because there was nothing left to question. The evidence was not abstract, it was operational, built into the system they all relied on, and Gregory's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders lowering just enough to signal that the ground beneath him had changed, his authority no longer anchored in certainty but in a moment that had already passed, and Vanessa took a step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but intentional, as if she were stepping fully into the space that had been denied to her only minutes ago. "I did not walk into the wrong room," she continued, her tone still even, still controlled. "You failed to recognize who was already in it." And the words did not accuse, they revealed, exposing the gap between perception and reality in a way that left no room for reinterpretation, and across the room Tyler Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest finally releasing as the truth he had seen on that screen now stood fully realized in front of everyone, no longer something he had to defend, but something that spoke for itself, and the room, once filled with quiet dismissal, now held a different kind of silence, one shaped not by judgment but by consequence, because every word that had been spoken before this moment still existed, still carried weight, and now they all had to sit with it, and Vanessa's gaze moved once more across the table, steady, composed, not searching for reaction but acknowledging presence, because this was not about proving who she was anymore, that had already been done, this was about what came next, and everyone in that room understood that without a single additional word being said. No one moved right away, not because they did not know what to do, but because every option they had a moment ago no longer applied, and the room that once operated with quiet confidence now sat in a kind of suspended clarity, where every assumption had been exposed and every word spoken earlier still echoed with new meaning, and Gregory Hale stood there, shoulders no longer squared with certainty but held in place by something heavier, something closer to realization than resistance, his eyes shifting briefly from the screen back to Vanessa Carter as if trying to recalibrate his understanding of the last 10 minutes, but the recalibration came too late, because the system had already spoken, the truth had already settled, and Vanessa did not rush into that silence, she let it hold, let it stretch just long enough for everyone in that room to feel it completely, the weight of misjudgment, the cost of assumption, the clarity of consequence, and then she stepped forward again, closing the small distance between herself and the head of the table, not to claim space but to define it, her presence now aligned fully with the authority that had been questioned, and when she spoke her voice remained steady, measured, but there was a firmness to it now that carried beyond the moment. "Before we continue," she said, her gaze moving deliberately across each executive seated there, "I want to be clear about something," and no one interrupted, no one shifted, because the tone had changed, not louder, not sharper, but grounded in something that did not invite interruption, and she continued. "What happened in this room was not a misunderstanding," the words landed evenly, without accusation, without hesitation, it was a decision, and that distinction settled deeply, because it removed the safety of confusion, it removed the idea that this could be explained away as an error or miscommunication, and in doing so it forced everyone to confront the moment as it truly was, and a senior director near the middle of the table lowered his gaze slightly, not out of guilt spoken aloud, but out of recognition. while another executive slowly closed her laptop, as if the need to verify anything further had already passed, and Gregory finally spoke, but his voice carried none of the certainty it had before. If there has been any oversight, he began, choosing his words carefully, we can address it internally and move forward, but even as he said it, the phrasing felt smaller than the moment, because the room had already moved past containment, past quiet correction, and Vanessa turned her head slightly toward him, her expression composed, not confrontational, but clear. This is internal, she said, and the simplicity of it reframed everything, because it reminded him, and everyone else, that this room, this moment, this system, all fell within her scope, her authority, her responsibility, and she let that sit for a second before continuing, and moving forward starts with accountability, and that word did not echo loudly, but it settled firmly, like a foundation being set beneath everything that would follow, and around the table the shift became visible in small ways, a straightened posture here, a quiet nod there, the kind of adjustments people make when they realize the standard has changed and they are now being measured against it, and Vanessa's gaze returned to the screen briefly before moving back to the room. Access logs, internal communications, and decision points from this morning will be reviewed, she said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a process, something structured, something inevitable, and we will address what needs to be addressed, and the calm in her voice made the outcome feel more certain, not less, because there was no emotion driving it, no reaction, just clarity, and Tyler Brooks stood there quietly, no longer the only one holding doubt, because now the entire room had stepped into it, into a space where perception no longer guided action, and truth had taken its place, and Vanessa let the silence return one more time, not as tension, but as transition, because the room was no longer reacting to her presence, it was adjusting to her leadership, and that shift, once it happens, does not reverse. It becomes the new standard whether anyone is ready for it or not. The room did not return to what it had been, because once a moment like that unfolds it does not reset, it redefines, and Vanessa Carter stood at the head of the table now not as someone who had claimed power, but as someone who had revealed it, and the distinction mattered, because nothing about her presence felt forced, nothing about her authority felt newly created, it had always been there. The room had simply failed to recognize it until it was too late to pretend otherwise, and the executives around the table sat differently now, not just physically but mentally, their posture more attentive, their focus sharpened by the quiet realization that leadership was no longer something they assumed, it was something they were now accountable to, and Gregory Hale remained still for a moment longer before finally stepping back from the table, not in retreat but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when resistance no longer makes sense, his voice lower now, measured in a way that reflected the shift that had taken place. Understood, he said, and it was a small word for a large correction, but it carried the weight of transition, because it marked the moment he moved from control to compliance, and Vanessa nodded once, not approving, not dismissing, simply acknowledging that the room had aligned with reality, and she turned her attention forward, her voice steady as she continued, we will proceed with the review as scheduled, and the sentence restored structure, not by ignoring what had happened but by placing it within a framework that moved forward without erasing it, and laptops reopened, screens adjusted, notes were pulled back into focus, but the energy had changed, because now every action carried awareness, every decision was made under a different standard, one that had been set not by policy but by example, and Tyler Brooks sat down slowly, his hands still resting on his tablet, the tension replaced by something quieter, a sense of having witnessed a moment that would not be forgotten, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise, controlled, and undeniable, and across the table a senior director spoke up. This time with clarity rather than assumption, presenting figures, outlining projections, engaging in the meeting as it was meant to happen from the beginning, and Vanessa listened, asked questions when necessary, guided the conversation with the same calm authority she had carried from the moment she entered, and there was no need to raise her voice, no